Welcome to another video of the Demos interview series. Today we're going to be speaking about constitutionalism and populism with very highly distinguished guests. I have here Mark Tushnet, Professor of Law at Harvard University, and Professor Martin Loughlin, Professor of Public Law at London School of Economics and Political Science. For this interview with me, I have Balázs Fekete, who is a member of the Institute for Legal Studies of the Center for Social Sciences, which coordinates Demos. Professor Mark Tushnet, how can we define the core of Western constitutionalism? How are some of the main components of it?
I'm smiling because that's an unfortunately difficult question. Partly because there are what I would describe as thick and thin understandings of constitutionalism. So the thick understanding of constitutionalism is one in which there are fairly extensive guarantees of human rights, a commitment to democratic governance, and entrenchment of those things, meaning that they can't be easily modified, although they can be amended, so there are ways of modifying them, but they are entrenched against sort of ordinary political change. That's a thick kind of idea. And I think it's right to associate that, as your question suggests, with Western constitutionalism. There's an ongoing discussion in China about whether there could be a kind of constitutionalism that wouldn't be like that, and I think the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want that, but they might want some other kind of constitutionalism. So at the other extreme, the thinnest kind of constitutionalism would be, I think, something like an idea that there will be something entrenched against ordinary political change. The entrenchment can be formal or informal. Most places now it's formal. That is, there's a written constitution that says, here's how things are going to be organized, and then there's an amendment rule that says you can change them if you want to, but it's more than ordinary politics. But exactly what's entrenched on this thin idea can vary quite substantially. So you could have a constitution that entrenches only the division of authority between the legislature and the executive, and not have any entrenched human rights, for example. So there are lots of variants, but the idea of entrenchment against ordinary political change, I think, is at the core of the thinnest kind of idea. I think this is something I've been working on now, a paper that I'm trying to develop. There may be inherent in the idea of, again, thin constitutionalism, that the people making decisions for the polity are sincerely guided by an interest in advancing the people's interests. That doesn't mean they have to be elected by the people. You could have a constitutional monarch who was sincerely guided by that sort of stuff. You could have a dominant political party or even a self-reproducing political party whose leaders were again sincerely guided by that. And I think you probably have to have some notion of an independent, call it a judiciary, to resolve conflicts. But again, what counts as independence will vary. The thinnest idea would be just some kind of independent decision maker that will make decisions with reference to law rather than mere policy. Okay, so that sets out a fairly wide spectrum of what constitutionalism can be.
How do you see this question from the British perspective? Can you add something, or can you specify something from the point of view of the British tradition as for the core of Western constitutionalism?
The British have a long tradition of constitutional government, but they do not have a modern constitution. And so the question of how far the British tradition of parliamentary government measures up against the criteria of constitutionalism very much depends on the variations of Mark's thin and thick ideas of a constitution. We don't have many of the features of what Mark would classify as being thick constitution, in the sense that we don't have constitutional law as fundamental law. We have a series of practices, but in terms of the public ethos, we have had a strong sense of constitutional government, and it's one in which, in the course of the modern era, has actually been a very successful constitution, because we have managed to make the transition from aristocratic to representative democratic government without the revolutionary rupture. And that has been a great achievement for us. But at the same time, that inheritance, the residue of the aristocratic dimensions to the constitution, are now posing increasingly difficult problems for us.
The constitutional populism. And then, Mark, is there such a thing as a conflict between constitutionalism and populism?
This is actually precisely the subject of this paper that I'm working on with a co-author. Our position at this point in our thinking is that there probably is a conflict, although it's sometimes quite a the inherent conflict is narrower than most people tend to think the conflict is. So for us, for me, populism means that all decisions are ultimately to be taken by the people. Sometimes that's through representative institutions, sometimes that's through the form of a constitutional frame of governance. But if the representative institutions don't adequately represent what the people want, or if the frame of government obstructs getting what the people want, then populism means that those things should be overridden. Sometimes this is phrased as populism is ultimately exclusively instrumental in terms of its orientation. Now, if that's true, then there will be circumstances in which a constitution that entrenches something will get in the way of the populist instrumental program. It's not clear. So yes, there will be conflicts. I should say it's fairly easy to generate examples where the conflict is one in which saying it should be resolved in favor of constitutionalism isn't obvious. So in the United States, we have an entrenched system of enacting legislation that makes it difficult to, that if the people of the United States wanted a political program of substantial economic redistribution, our frame of government would make it difficult to accomplish that. So populism would mean you should just override the frame of government. But under that kind of example, maybe constitutionalism should be subordinated to populism. There are other examples where the conflict would come out the other way, but I guess, yes, there is a conflict. It's not always the case that the conflict should be resolved in favor of constitutionalism.
Okay, but is populism coded the very essence of what majoritarian democracy is? Would you say that populism is something that is already built in into what it is?
There are many technologies of majoritarian democracy. If populism means that the people's will, reliably determined, should always prevail, then some of the technologies of majoritarian democracy will fit populism better than others will. But to the extent that there's a notion of the people's will that reliably determined should govern, populism is, to some extent, majoritarian and democratic.
If I could come in there on that point, I think one of the reasons why majoritarianism doesn't equate with populism is because of the role of mass political parties, which are coalitions of interest. And we manage transition, we manage change through time by the switch between 2 or 3 major political parties in a constitutional system. So precisely because they are major parties with branches with different views, they manage some of the tensions of majoritarianism within the party political structure. And one of the problems we might envisage arising with the growth of the phenomenon of populism is the fragmentation and disintegration of these big political parties that have made the transition to democracy over the last century or so. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the breakdown of party political systems, and that's leading to this sense of the will of the people as majoritarian.
Martin, you used a very fascinating term in one of your latest articles that was constitutional degradation. Could you explain it a bit in this context, what you meant by this term?
The Italian political philosopher Giovanni Sartori wrote a classic article about 50 years ago called Constitutionalism. And Sartori drew a distinction between 3 types of constitutions. One is, he called, guarantist constitutions.
La fonction garantiste.
And that's, I think, very much like the thick constitutionalism that Mark has elaborated. And then he said there are also nominal constitutions that happen to be just the form that the state takes, and the constitution establishes the framework of government, not necessarily with a strong fundamental rights protection. And then there's the facade constitution, the constitution that is there on paper but doesn't actually explain much about how political power is actually exercised. I think, to put it in Sartori's frame, what we're seeing with the phenomenon of constitutional degradation is the guarantist constitution, the constitution that seeks to preserve liberty by limiting government and providing a strong platform of fundamental rights entrenched within the document. This guarantist constitution remains, the framework remains intact, but actually the practices are such that it looks more like a nominal or even a facade constitution. So constitutional degradation is the loss of the culture of constitutionalism while retaining the form of the constitutional edifice. It's not an overthrow of the regime. We live in a world where many would say constitutional democracy is the only legitimating principle of government today. But then we have to work out what constitutional democracy means. Some would say it's an oxymoron. And constitutional degradation is an expression of this, of the sense that we retain the constitutional form of constitutional democracy, but no longer adhere to the practices and the culture that makes it truly work.
Mark, can you agree with this perspective? What was explained by
Yeah,
Martin?
so I have two reactions. One, this is not a criticism of the formulations that Martin has just offered, but it's an observation that even I think properly understood, the guaranteed constitutions are simultaneously about limiting government power and empowering governments to act. And I think one of the misleading things about at least U.S. discourse about constitutionalism is that it focuses far too much on constitutions as limiting government power and not enough on understanding how governments actually create the opportunities for the exercise of power in the service of the nation's people. Okay, so the second observation is that the term degradation to describe the movement from the guarantees to the nominal has almost inevitably a pejorative tone, and I'm not sure that such a movement is necessarily bad. So my biggest sort of hobby horse in U.S. constitutionalism is that the courts, in the name of enforcing rights, have absorbed too much policy-making power from the democratically elected legislature. If you characterize the current situation in the U.S. as a guaranteed constitution, then I do want to move away from that towards a more nominal constitution. Facade is a different matter, I think, entirely. To some extent, the movement from a guaranteed constitution to the nominal one can be, not always is, but can be the reclamation of democratic self-governments by the people themselves. Again, importantly, organized through political parties, and the nature of the party organizations will significantly affect whether that movement is a desirable one or not.
Would you like to pick up on this?
Yes, I don't disagree with what Mark is saying there at all. The degradation doesn't come from the loss, simply from the loss of the entrenched institutional protections. It also comes from the loss of the democratic dimension to constitutional democracy, because what we are seeing today is the hollowing out of democracy, and that is manifested in various forms. One of them is the decline, as I've already mentioned, of political parties to act as the channel for converting common opinion into real political action. Another is the sense in constitutional democracies that legislatures are central to that, but we see more and more power being taken away from legislatures to the executive, or even the courts in certain respects. We see the growth of transnational governmental regulatory institutions that are exercising governmental power, all of which makes it more difficult to make it susceptible to accountability through standard constitutional reforms. So constitutional degradation is not. It's a degradation of the democratic aspects of a constitution, as well as the liberal rights protecting aspects of a constitution. In that sense, I think the phenomenon is more complicated, because yes, we would like to. We probably both agree that we want to see a greater expression of democratic will formation through these constitutional forms, but the failure to be able to deliver on that is actually part of the problem.
Do you see any connections between the rise of populism and constitutional degradation?
And this this kind of hollowing out process, what you mentioned.
To put it contentiously, one could say many people think that populism is the cause of constitutional degradation, but you could say populism is the effect of constitutional degradation rather than the cause. In fact, it's both the cause, it's both an effect of constitutional degradation and also a cause to further the degradation. But I don't see, I see populism, the rise of populism as a, it's difficult to say it's even an ideology. It's a psychological phenomenon, I think. But I see it first and foremost as an effect of the loss of authority of the standard forms of constitutional democracy. It's a response to that loss of power. But then when it manifests itself in itself vying for power, it can be a cause of further degradation.
Mark, do you agree with Martin's latest observations as for the US?
So yes, I do. I mean, my way of capturing the populism as effect is that for a variety of reasons, including, well, there are political economy reasons, there are reasons rooted in the organization of political parties, there are reasons in the United States generated by constitutional doctrine for the, in this instance, for the increase in the power of the executive branch as opposed to the legislature, and the increasing difficulty of getting legislative action. My formulation is that under those circumstances, some political actors, I think of them as opportunistic, see the chance of riding a populist program to power. That is, there's been this hollowing out, and now there are some political actors who see that they can, for their own purposes, take advantage of what has already occurred. Now, it's also the case that these kinds of political actors have been around all along, and they've been contributing to some of the things that lead to the hollowing out. In the United States, for example, Donald Trump is the result of 20 to 25 years of what we in the country, in the U.S., call legislative gridlock, which has led to the rise of presidential power. But the gridlock results from some changes within the structure of the Republican Party that have occurred over, I would say, 30 to 40 years. So that's the sort of reciprocal cause and effect kind of idea. But yeah, I think Martin's description is just, exactly right.
There's a certain gap between how citizens perceive the law and then how the law actually works for them. So is it possible to narrow down this gap just by enhancing or providing new constitutional provisions? What would you say?
And perhaps to counteract populism by this way, getting people a bit closer to constitutional ideas, values, rule of law.
Instinct on this, I have two, to some extent, conflicting instincts on this. One is that there's an important role for what, again, in the U.S. we would call civic education, which would, the underside of civic education is that it is inevitably elite-led, and so might not generate the kind of reconstitution or the filling in of the hollowed out state. The other instinct is to say the best way for people to understand what the Constitution means is for them to be involved in Constitution-directed actions. Here, the kind of example I like, it's a tricky one, but is the practice, actually now more widespread than I thought it would be, of participatory budgeting, where ordinary people in neighborhoods just come up with a budget for their neighborhood and it filters up through the system. But there are meetings in the neighborhoods to talk about what the money allocated to the neighborhood should be spent on. There are a variety of these techniques of engaging people in actual, I would say, lawmaking practice, which is a form of education in constitutionalism, which I'm pretty enthusiastic about. But I have to say, elites, many of whom are like me, are pretty skeptical about that kind of thing.
Let me take a different dimension of that multi-layered question. Throughout the ages, there have been movements to strive for the simplification of law. In the English tradition, the levelers in the mid-17th century were very much pursuing that line. We see it with Jeremy Bentham in the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Real laws for real people, keep it simple, direct, none of the mumbo-jumbo of the common law rhetoric. And in the 20th century, even we have the movement which the American legal realists are part of too, where they're saying let's not make law a grand concept. It's a simple instrument, a means to an end, and let's talk about what end do we want to achieve and what are the instruments. So looking at law purely as an instrumental technique for achieving certain objectives. We might want that world, but unfortunately the world is a bit more complicated these days, and that causes us to reify law and to think that there are great abstractions in law. The rule of law, ubiquitous phrase that it is a perfect illustration of this. No one knows what it means. Everybody inserts their own meaning into the concept of the rule of law, so we can all agree on, yes, we're in favor of the rule of law, but if I ask you what do you mean by the rule of law, chances are you wouldn't even be able to give me a coherent answer. But we all believe in it.